Study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Hello, everyone, and welcome. For this presentation, we will look into the life, works, and contributions of scholar Dr. Asa Hilliard III. My name is Jasmine Randall, and I am so excited to share the contributions of this particular educational psychology professor. Dr. Asa was born August 22nd, 1933 in Galveston, Texas. When we look at his education, he received a bachelor's degree in 1955 from the University of Denver. We will also notice shortly after working in the Denver public school system, he was also a professor at the University of Denver. He received his master's degree in counseling in 1961. He received a doctoral degree in educational psychology in 1963. After working for the Denver public school system, working as a professor at the University of Denver, he also served as the department chair and dean of education at the San Francisco State University. Also, throughout his career, he served as a consultant to the Peace Corps. He served in a capacity as a superintendent of schools in Monrovia, Liberia for nearly 2 years. And at the latter part of his career, he served as a professor at the University, Georgia State University, where he was a professor of urban education. He fulfilled many roles and duties in the Department of Educational Policy Studies and the Department of Educational Psychology and Special Education. Throughout his service at many of the different universities, Dr. Asa Hilliard led study groups in places such as Egypt and Guyana. Dr. Hilliard had 4 children, and he was married to Patsy Joe. Patsy Joe Hilliard is an African American educator. She was also an education administrator and the former mayor of East Point, Georgia. She was known to be the first woman to be the member of the South San Francisco Unified School District and the first African American woman mayor of East Point, Georgia, and the state of Georgia. Scholars and theories. While Dr. Asa Hilliard was very influential himself, there were several heavy hitters in the field of education that has influenced his work, and that he also had the opportunity to collaborate with firsthand. I also included an aspect for scholars and theorists that influenced him from a family aspect. From one of his interviews, I learned that Dr. Hilliard's dad, Asa Grant Hilliard, was a uh, he was very influential in the field of education as well. So I am positive that many of his dad's works and philosophies for teaching had an impact on Dr. Asa's foundation. His dad was involved in the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. His dad also and his uncles, they were also involved and was the founders of the Texas State Teachers Association for Black teachers. When we look at other scholars and theorists, individuals such as Amilcar Cabral, Carter G. Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Barbara Sizemore were very influential in the work of Dr. Asa Hilliard. Barbara Sizemore says that schools are failing students because they're not tailoring instruction to fit the specific needs of the students. Both Hilliard and Sizemore agree that an effective school must have high expectations and an unshakable belief that all students can learn. Sizemore rates that instruction as the number, she rates instruction as the number one priority for an effective school. The collaboration of Barbara Sizemore and Dr. Asa Hilliard, they both agree that, or their work both require individuals to look at familiar ideas, but to look at them in new ways to be effective. For example, Hilliard believed the primary job of policymakers was to ensure the accountability in the system. One example he gave was that about how policymakers cannot micromanage different schools. And in that particular conversation, he talked about the lack of accountability among or within policymakers to allow a school to continue to function without any change in leadership when the kids continue to fail or the data shows the lack of success year after year. Hilliard and Barbara Sizemore in that particular article talked about the concern about policymakers who feel the need to mandate changes from open to closed classrooms from one textbook or one reading program to another. They encourage educators and school administrators to shift their focus towards the input that the students receive in their education more so than the resources or more so than heavily observing the output of the success of the student. Carter G. Woodson was an American historian. He was also an author, a journalist, and the founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Much of Woodson's contribution to the field of education or to African American, the education of African Americans at large, is geared towards deconstructing the idea that people of African descent, how they must rely on other cultures as models to which they aspire. Woodson pretty much writes or he grounded work around that around how people of African descent must draw inspiration towards the guidance of their own cultural and historical resources. Dr. Asa Hilliard and his thoughts and the thoughts of Carter G. Woodson, they sort of align or connect at the thought of historical consciousness. Hilliard emphasizes that the central role historical knowledge of self plays in determining how people define the parameters of their own philosophy and how it impacts their education. Dr. Asa Hilliard's research and his work is important or significant to the field of education because he challenged people to study. He challenged people to reconstruct African American indigenous socialization systems. His research has enhanced the work and knowledge for students and professionals around ancient African history, the ancient African culture, education, and society. A particular article by Darif Jameson, he wrote in the Journal of Black Studies, he shares that Hilliard's educational background, both his formal and informal contributions and work, has prepared him to use his skills and expertise in a manner that will function in the best interest of African people. Jameson goes on to write how Hilliard understood the importance of learning various forms of knowledge and constructing pedagogical approaches that could introduce learners to a holistic education. Many people continue to admire. They also continue to study the fact that Asa Hilliard's involvement in education and the Re-Africanization process of African Americans. They admire how it serves as a prime example of how African-centered practice can be used to maximize the educational potential and possibilities for African people. I also read in an article how Hilliard was passionate about African American people doing the work and doing the research, going back to their roots themselves and being their own best advocates. And so I think that is really important and profound in the work to create a more culturally relevant educational system. Dr. Hilliard's work, his collections, any of his published pieces, resources, or research is not just beneficial for African American scholars, but it can be useful for anyone looking to rediscover their own identity, anyone interested in the pedagogical approaches that they could use to provide learners with a holistic approach to education. Topics, themes, and theories that were commonly observed throughout the work and contributions of Dr. Asa Hilliard were African American history, African history, teaching strategies, public policies, psychology, in particular educational psychology, standards, and more specifically, standardized testing. When looking at standardized testing and the psychology approach, though a lot of those things were pretty common in one they share article topics. For example, one article that Hilliard wrote or addressed, he questioned why should psychology be used in schools at all? He questioned what is the benefit of psychological assessments, but specifically what is the benefit of mental measurement of the teaching and learning process of children? Why should the mental measurement be used as a criminal justice? What is this? What is it benefit? What is the benefit? And why should mental measurement be used in public welfare? Those were common questions, common thoughts that Dr. Hilliard used to drive his research. A lot of that gears relates back to the standards when it comes to how even if we are using psychological assessments for the entrance or the measurement of success of students, Dr. Hilliard's work was geared towards just putting out the idea that standards were not the same across the nation, from state to state, even sometimes within states. All students do not have access to the same exact standards that they're being held to perform. For example, one of the national tests that I remember reading about was a test that students had to take, and a big portion of the questions geared around uh, geography. And Dr. Hilliard's point was students having to take that test living in Florida, how that test was unfit, biased, and unfair to those students because they didn't even have geography courses in their high school. As a result, the students eventually that particular school system eventually received geography standards and course options. However, the idea of it is still questionable. Now I will highlight the reoccurring topic of teaching strategies. One particular article that I will circle back to, as mentioned in the presentation before, was the article of Dr. Asa Hilliard and Barbara Sizemore, where they talked about the the how poor students are at risk. Dr. Hilliard notes that while successful schools may have different philosophies on education and educational practices, schools share 9 principles or essential elements. And those elements are staff development, instructional leadership, school leadership, high expectation, parent involvement, productive climate and culture, monitoring student success and progress, effective instructional strategies, and learning essential skills. Those particular elements are key to the success of any school. Hilliard believe, regardless of the demographics of the school and the students that they serve, that following that particular structure or fine tuning each of those elements will lead to a successful school. In closing, we will look and highlight a few of the impact or present contributions that Dr. Asa Hilliard has left behind to the field of education and the field of psychology. Dr. Hilliard led several study groups of students in Egypt and Ghana. Actually, towards the latter part of his life, in his last few days, he was leading a study group of students. So he passed away still passionate, still committed, and doing the work and serving others. That was a school, Asa Hilliard Elementary, in Georgia, that has been devoted and named after Dr. Hilliard for over 40 years. The scholarship of Dr. Hilliard has impacted the fields in educational psychology. It has impacted testing and measurement, teacher education, and African American history. A common reflection that I read, and also that I have been compelled to feel myself in reading about Dr. Asa, was that a lot of his lectures and teaching left people seeking to do better in their practice, allowing them to want to become more in their scholarship and to desire to hear more of his learning and his wisdom. He was definitely an inspiration, and he was very effective and knowledgeable about just his niche. And so I am very fortunate to study and share what I have learned about Dr. Asa Hilliard. Thank you.